Hello, listeners, and welcome to Higher Level History. I'm Professor Carthel. This podcast is a companion to the American Yawp online textbook, and the idea is simple. Each episode, we step behind the chapter to find the stories worth telling. We're going to slow down on the moments worth slowing down on, follow the people the textbook can only mention in passing, and ask the questions that make history feel less like a subject and more like a story. Let's get into it. Chapter 5 of the American Yawp is called Colonial Society, and it covers roughly the 100 years between the arrival of most colonial settlers and the beginning of the Revolution. The chapter moves through the Consumer Revolution, slavery as it developed differently across different colonies, the Great Awakening, print culture, and the 7 Years' War. And last but not least, Pontiac's War. What holds all of it together is a question the chapter never quite asks directly, but is always circling. How do people who think of themselves as British start becoming something else? That is what this episode is about. And it turns out the answer has less to do with politics and more to do with people. It was October 1723. Benjamin Franklin was 17 years old and completely alone. He had crossed from New York by boat, then walked the last stretch into Philadelphia on foot, his clothes still damp from a night spent sleeping on the riverbank. He had no contracts in this city, no family, no letter of introduction. He had a Dutch dollar and a copper shilling in his pocket, and the knowledge that if his brother James ever found him, he would drag him back to Boston in chains. He was hungry, and he was a fugitive. What happened in Boston was still raw. Benjamin had been apprenticed to his brother James since he was 12 years old, bound by a legal contract that gave James complete authority over him until he turned 21. James ran the New England Courant, one of Boston's most provocative newspapers, the kind that published opinions the colonial establishment would rather not see in print. Franklin learned the trade at his brother's side. He set the type, he ran the press, he swept the floors, and at night alone, he taught himself to write. He discovered a collection of essays in his father's library, polished and precise. He copied them by hand until he understood how they worked. Then he began writing his own. He knew James would never publish anything signed by his teenage apprentice, so he invented someone else entirely. He slid the first letter under the print shop door in the middle of the night and waited. The name he chose was Silence Dogood, a middle-aged widow with sharp eyes and sharper opinions about Boston society. She had things to say about the behaviors of Harvard men, about the treatment of women, and about the hypocrisies of the powerful. The readers of the New England Courant loved her. James published 14 of her letters, praising the author to anyone who would listen, desperately trying to discover who Silence Dogood really was. Franklin watched all of this from across the print shop and said nothing. When he finally revealed himself, he was expecting admiration. What he got was rage. James was not impressed that his 16-year-old brother had fooled him and delighted his readership. He was humiliated. The beatings that had always been part of their working relationship got worse. James made clear in ways both formal and physical that Benjamin Franklin's ideas were not welcome in his newspaper, his print shop, or his life. Franklin finished out the year. Then he packed what little he owned and left. He was not the kind of person who stayed where his ideas were not welcome. He found a baker on the street and asked for 3 pennies worth of bread. The baker handed him 3 large puffy rolls, more than he expected. Franklin tucked one under each arm and walked into the city eating the third, looking up at the buildings and the people and the noise of a place that had no idea who he was. Philadelphia in 1723 was the fastest growing city in the British colonies. Ships arrived daily from London, Bristol, Barbados, and beyond, unloading cargo onto docks crowded with merchants and sailors speaking half a dozen languages. The streets smelled of salt water and sawdust and horses. Everywhere Franklin looked, things were being built. He found work at a print shop within days. He was good at the work because he had been doing it since he was 12, and he was even better at the thinking behind it. Words were the only tools he had ever trusted. In Boston, his brother had published his essays without knowing who wrote them, and when he found out, he made clear that a younger brother's ideas were not welcome in his newspaper. Franklin had left. Philadelphia, it turned out, was exactly the kind of city that rewarded people who refused to stay small. 4 years later, Franklin was no longer hungry, but he was restless. By 1727, he had his own print shop, his own newspaper, and a growing reputation as the kind of man other ambitious men wanted to know. He was 21 years old. He gathered a small group of friends and tradesmen in a room above a tavern on a weeknight and called it the Junto. Leather apron men, he called them. Printers, surveyors, a clerk, a bartender. None of them were wealthy. None of them were connected to the colonial elite, but all of them had opinions about how the world worked and the nagging sense that those opinions deserved to be heard. The rules of the Junto were simple. Every member had to produce an essay on some topic of morals, politics, or philosophy. Every meeting ended with questions. Was there any deserving stranger in town who needed support? Had anyone observed a recent act of injustice that deserved attention? What could be done to improve the city? Franklin wrote the questions himself. He already understood something that most people his age did not: that the distance between asking a question and changing the world was shorter than it appeared. Outside the window, Philadelphia was still growing. Ships were still arriving. The colonies were still British, at least for now, and most of the men in the room would have told you they were proud to be British. But in that room, something else was also growing. Something that didn't have a name yet. Benjamin Franklin was 21 years old when he founded the Junto. He was 48 when he drew a snake in a newspaper. In May of 1754, Franklin published a small woodcut image in the Pennsylvania Gazette, a serpent severed into 8 segments, each piece labeled with the name of a colony or region. Below it, 3 words: join or die. It was the first political cartoon in American history, and Franklin drew it as an act of loyalty to the British Empire. He was not arguing against Britain. He was arguing for the colonies to organize themselves well enough to fight Britain's war. France and Britain had been feuding over the boundaries of their North American empires for decades, and by 1754, that feud was turning bloody. A young Virginia militia officer named George Washington had just killed a French diplomat in the wilderness of western Pennsylvania, and the continent was sliding toward open conflict. Franklin understood what was coming. He had spent 30 years watching colonial society develop, and he knew its weaknesses. 13 colonies pulling in 13 different directions were not going to win a war against anybody. Join or die was a plea for coordination, nothing more. But look at what the image actually was. 13 colonies imagined as a single, albeit broken, body. The idea that they might act together, the suggestion that their survival depended on unity rather than individual interests. Franklin had no idea he was sketching the blueprint for a unified nation. He thought he was saving the British Empire. That gap between what he intended and what the image would eventually mean tells you almost everything you need to know about colonial America. These were British people, thoroughly, genuinely, proudly British. They bought British goods to signal their respectability. They fought British war with genuine pride. The consumer revolution that had reshaped colonial life over the previous half century had done so by pulling the colonies deeper into the British Atlantic economy, not away from it. A successful merchant in Philadelphia or Boston measured his standing by how closely his household resembled a proper English household. To be prosperous in colonial America was to be visibly British. The Great Awakening had shaken religious authority across the colonies through the 1730s and 1740s, but even that was an Atlantic Protestant movement. George Whitefield, the most famous preacher of the era, crossed the ocean 13 times. The revivals that swept from Georgia to Massachusetts were part of a broader current running through the entire British Protestant world. Colonial Americans who questioned their ministers were not questioning their king. Well, not yet. And politically, for all the friction between colonial assemblies and royal governors, most colonists understood themselves as heirs to the British tradition of representative government. They were not demanding something new. They were demanding what they believed they were already entitled to as British subjects. The right to consent to their own taxation, the right to trial by jury, the right to be governed by laws they had a hand in making. These were English ideas. Colonists had simply taken them seriously. So when the 7 Years' War began in 1756, colonial Americans fought. They fought hard and they fought well. Tens of thousands of colonial militiamen joined British regulars in a war that stretched from the forests of Pennsylvania to the plains outside Quebec City. It was the largest military conflict North America had ever seen, and when it ended in 1763 with the British capture of French Canada, colonists celebrated as a shared victory between the American colonies and the motherland. They had bled for the empire. They had earned their place in it. The British government, however, saw it differently. Strapped for cash after nearly a decade of expensive warfare, Parliament turned to the colonies to help pay the bills. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, taxes on paper, tea, glass, paint, and lead. These were not enormous sums in the abstract, but they landed on the precise goods and products that colonial Americans had spent a century using to define themselves as respectable British subjects. And they were imposed without colonial consent, by a parliament in which colonists had no representation. Then came the Proclamation of 1763. Colonists were forbidden from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, the very lands they had just fought to win. Britain needed to manage its new territory and avoid another costly conflict with Native Americans. The logic was understandable from London's perspective, but from the colonies, it looked like betrayal. Something shifted. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment when colonial Americans looked at each other and decided they were no longer British. It was slower than that and more confusing. It didn't feel like a political awakening to the people living through it. It felt like something more subtle. A growing suspicion that the relationship they thought they had with Britain had never been what they imagined. Being British and being American were starting to feel like two different things. Franklin felt it as clearly as anyone. The man who had drawn join or die as an act of imperial loyalty would spend the next 2 decades trying to hold the empire together through diplomacy, negotiation, and the sheer force of his reputation. He believed, longer than most, that reconciliation with Britain was possible, that Britain would come to her senses, that the colonies and the mother country could find their way back to each other. He was wrong. But the fact that he tried tells you something important. The revolution was not inevitable. It was the result of poorly made decisions, opportunities missed, and a government that confused taxation with governance and compliance with loyalty. The young men who had grown up in colonial society, who had learned in print shops and junto meetings and colonial assemblies that their ideas deserved to be heard, they were paying attention. They were taking notes. They would not stay where their ideas were not welcome. Everything we've talked about so far has been the view from inside the colonies looking outward. Franklin, the juntos, the colonists who fought and bled and then felt Britain turn its back on them. In today's special segment, we're going to step off the colonial road and look at the same moment through native eyes. In 1765, a Choctaw leader named Alibamo Mingo sat down with a British superintendent and delivered one of the most quietly devastating assessments of the 7 Years' War that anyone bothered to record. He did not come to the meeting as a defeated man. He came as a diplomat. He had spent decades navigating the complicated world of European colonial politics, and he was good at it. The Choctaw had maintained relationships with the French for 80 years. Trade networks, military alliances, diplomatic gifts, a carefully balanced set of options that gave his people leverage in a world dominated by powers much larger than themselves. And then the French lost the war. Not just a battle, not just a territory. The French lost their entire presence in North America, and with them went 80 years of Choctaw diplomacy and agreements. Alibamo Mingo was now sitting across a table from the only European power left on the continent. He had no leverage, he had no alternatives, and he knew it. What he said in that meeting, however, is worth considering. He told the British superintendent that when he was young, the French came bearing abundance, and he took them by the hand. Now he saw another race of white men arriving with the same abundance. He was willing to extend the same hand, but he made clear in the careful language of a man who understood his position exactly that the generosity would need to flow both ways. Then he said something that cuts through all of it. With respect to the land, he said, I was not consulted in it. No anger, no accusation, just the plain statement of a man acknowledging a reality he had no power to change. The Treaty of Paris that ended the 7 Years' War had transferred enormous territories between European powers. Britain gained French Canada. Spain gained Louisiana. Lines were drawn on maps in distant capitals by men who had never set foot on the land they were dividing. And the people who actually lived on that land, who had built their lives and their nations on it for generations, were not in the room when the decisions were made. Colonial Americans celebrated the end of the 7 Years' War as a triumph. They had fought for the empire and won. They had earned their place in it. The episode we've been building today is about what happened when Britain made clear that place wasn't quite what they imagined. Alibamo understood that feeling. He just understood it without any of the illusions. He had never believed that land was Britain's to give. He had never believed that French had the right to trade away Choctaw territory in a peace treaty. But he was also a realist. The words had been spoken, he said, and traced with a lasting mark. He would not contradict them. What he asked for instead was dignity, that his authority be respected, that his people's needs be met, that the British traders who came into Choctaw territory behaved themselves. On that last point, he was very blunt. He had heard from Creeks and Cherokees that wherever the English went, they caused disturbances, that they lived under no government and paid no respect to wisdom or station. He had hoped those stories were wrong. They were not. Alibamo Mingo is not in your textbook the way Benjamin Franklin is. He doesn't have a monument or a museum or a face on a bill. But he was sitting in the same historical moment, watching the same events unfold, asking the same fundamental question about what it meant to be a people with a future in this new world, but with no say in how it was built. The difference is that Franklin got to help make it. When you open Chapter 5 of the American Yawp, you'll find the full sweep of 18th century colonial life. Pay attention to how all those things connect. The chapter isn't just describing different aspects of colonial society. It's describing a society that is becoming more itself, more coherent, and more confident, right up until the moment Britain makes clear that confidence is not welcome. As you read, hold on to one question. Who does colonial society leave out? Franklin's story is compelling precisely because the world he moved through was, for someone like him, genuinely full of possibility. Ask yourself, who did not have that possibility, those opportunities? And ask yourself what that tells you about the society that was forming. Chapter 5 of the American Yawp is available for free at americanyawp.com. Read it alongside this episode, not instead of it. I'm Professor Carthel. This has been Higher Level History. That wraps up this episode of Higher Level History with Professor Carthel. Don't forget to check the episode description for full music and sound clip licensing information. If you have any questions or simply want to get in touch, feel free to reach out to me at prof.carthel@higherlevelhistory.com. And if you haven't already, head over to theamericanyawp.com to access your free online copy of the American Yawp textbook. The podcast and the textbook work best together. Higher Level History is an independent educational resource and is not affiliated with any academic institution. Until next time, I'm Professor Carthel.